The village of Lira was quiet, as it always was at dusk. The soft hum of crickets filled the air, and the twin rivers, which flowed calmly just beyond the village, gleamed under the setting sun. The rivers were a mystery, feared by everyone. No one was allowed to cross them. Stories passed down from elders said the rivers were a passage between the world of the living and the dead. Nia stood at the riverbank, staring at the water. Her father, Juma, had gone missing a week ago. He was a kind man, always telling stories of their ancestors, always smiling. But that day, he left for the forest and never came back. Some villagers whispered that the twin rivers had taken him. Others believed he wandered too far into the woods. Nia refused to believe he was gone forever. Papa wouldn't leave me, she whispered to herself. He wouldn't. As night fell, Nia's heart filled with determination. She could no longer sit and wait. She would cross the rivers, no matter what the village rules said. She would find her father, wherever he was. But crossing the twin rivers meant facing the unknown, a world no one had returned from. The next morning, Nia packed a small bag with food and water, careful not to wake her mother. As she approached the rivers, the air around her felt heavier, and the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to fade away. The water looked still, almost too still, as if it were waiting for her. Nia hesitated. The stories her grandmother told about the rivers echoed in her mind. Those who crossed the twin rivers never returned the same, her grandmother had warned. But Nia couldn't stop now. She had to find her father. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the shallow part of the river. The cold water sent shivers up her legs, but she pressed on. As soon as her feet touched the other side, the world around her shifted. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence filled the space. Everything looked the same, yet different, darker, quieter. She looked around, but something was off. The village was nowhere in sight. Instead, there were shadows moving in the distance, and the trees seemed taller, older. Suddenly, she heard a whisper. It was faint, but it sounded like her father's voice. Nia. Her heart raced. Was it really him? Where was he? She called out, but the voice faded. Nia tightened her grip on her bag and ventured deeper into the unknown, unaware of the spirits watching her every move. As Nia ventured further into the unfamiliar land, the whispers grew louder. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, but every time she turned, they vanished. The trees were twisted and bent, as if they had seen too many years go by. Nia's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept walking, determined to follow the voice she had heard. Nia. Nia. The whisper called again, this time closer. Papa. Is that you? She called out, her voice trembling. But no answer came. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, with a face hidden beneath a dark hood. Nia stepped back, her hands shaking. The figure raised its hand, pointing to a path that led deeper into the forest. Who are you? Nia asked, her voice small. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for her to make a choice. Nia hesitated, but something inside her urged her to follow the path. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had come. The path twisted and turned, leading Nia through dense trees and thorny bushes. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold her back. Strange figures floated between the trees, their faces blank and eyes hollow. These weren't like the villagers she knew. These were spirits, wandering aimlessly. One of the spirits drifted close to Nia, its empty eyes fixed on her. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The spirit spoke in a low, raspy voice. Why have you come? No one crosses the rivers, not without a price. I'm looking for my father, Nia replied, her voice barely a whisper. He disappeared, and I need to find him. The spirit stared at her for a long moment before speaking again. You will not find what you seek without facing the truth. Then, it drifted away, leaving Nia alone once more. Nia didn't understand what the spirit meant, but she couldn't stop now. She had to keep moving. She had to find her father. As Nia followed the path, she eventually came to a clearing. In the center stood a village, but it was not like Lira. The houses were old and crumbling, their thatched roofs sagging with age. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Nia approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the empty streets. "Hello," she called out, but there was no response. Suddenly, the door of one of the houses creaked open, and an old woman stepped out. Her eyes were milky white, and her skin was wrinkled like old leather. She looked directly at Nia, as if she had been expecting her. "You're not supposed to be here," the woman said, her voice rough. "I'm looking for my father," Nia explained, stepping closer. "He disappeared, and I crossed the twin rivers to find him." The old woman's expression softened, but her voice remained cold. "Many have crossed those rivers, child. Some looking for lost loved ones, others seeking things they should not. But those rivers, they do not give back easily." Nia felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you know where my father is?" The old woman looked away, her face clouded with sorrow. "The rivers took him, just as they have taken many before him." Nia's heart sank. Could it be true? Was her father really lost to the twin rivers? But she refused to believe it. "There must be a way to bring him back," she pleaded. "There has to be." The old woman sighed, shaking her head. "If he is lost, then he is now one of them." She pointed to the spirits that wandered the edges of the village. "But even the lost can return, if the right price is paid." "What do you mean?" Nia asked, stepping closer. The old woman's gaze grew darker. "The rivers take what they want, and they do not give without a cost. To find your father, you must first understand why he was taken." Nia frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The old woman turned away. "Your father wasn't just a simple man, child. He had secrets tied to this place, to the rivers. You will have to uncover those secrets if you want to save him." Nia's mind raced. Secrets? What secrets could her father possibly have? She had always known him as a loving father, a man who told her stories and cared for their family. But now, she realized, there was much she didn't know. Determined to find answers, Nia ventured deeper into the village. The spirits continued to drift in and out of view, their empty eyes following her every move. It felt as if they were trying to tell her something, but she didn't know how to understand their silent messages. As she passed one of the houses, a sudden memory flashed through her mind, a memory of her father telling her a story about the rivers. She had been young, and he had warned her never to go near them. But why? What did he know about the rivers that no one else did? Lost in thought, Nia didn't notice the figure that had appeared in front of her until she nearly walked into it. She gasped and stepped back, her eyes widening in fear. It was a man, tall and thin, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were sunken, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame, as if they had not been worn in years. He stared at Nia with a strange intensity, his gaze piercing through her. "You are his daughter," the man said, his voice low and raspy. Nia swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes. Do you know my father?" The man's expression darkened. "I know of him. He crossed the rivers long ago, and he left something behind. Something dangerous." Nia's heart raced as the man's words echoed in her mind. "Something dangerous," she repeated, her voice trembling. Her father had never mentioned anything about danger or secrets. The man's eyes darkened as he continued. Your father was not an ordinary man. He came here long before you were born, seeking answers from the twin rivers. He made a deal, but the rivers never forget. Now, you are here to pay for what he left behind. Nia shook her head, confused. What deal? What did he leave behind? The man stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. A promise. He promised the rivers something precious. But promises to the rivers are never simple. He thought he could escape, but now his debt has come due. Nia's breath caught in her throat. What kind of promise could her father have made? And why hadn't he told her any of this? Her hands clenched into fists as she tried to hold back tears. She had come to find her father, but now it seemed she had stepped into a mystery far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. What do I have to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. To save him, you must finish what he started. Only then can he be freed from the river's grasp. As Nia continued her journey, the weight of the man's words hung heavy on her heart. She didn't know what her father had promised, but she was determined to find out. If there was any way to save him, she would do whatever it took. The path led Nia deeper into the strange world, the trees growing taller and more twisted. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers of the spirits seemed to grow louder. But she pressed on, her determination stronger than her fear. As she rounded a bend, she came face to face with a large stone archway. Beyond it lay the twin rivers, shimmering like silver under the pale light. But this time, the rivers were not calm. Their waters churned violently, as if stirred by something deep within. Standing at the edge of the rivers were two figures, cloaked in dark robes. Their faces were hidden, but Nia could feel their gaze upon her. These were the guardians of the rivers, the ones who watched over the passage between the worlds of the living and the dead. Nia swallowed hard and approached them, her heart pounding in her chest. I've come to save my father, she said, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. The guardians did not speak, but one of them raised a hand, motioning for her to stop. To save him, you must face the trials of the rivers, the guardian said, their voice echoing like the wind through the trees. Only those who are worthy may cross. Nia nodded, determination burning in her chest. I'll do whatever it takes. The guardians exchanged a glance before the second one spoke. The rivers do not give without taking. You must be prepared to sacrifice. Nia's heart tightened at the word. Sacrifice? What would she have to give up to save her father? But she had no choice. She had come too far to turn back now. The guardian stepped aside, allowing Nia to pass through the stone archway. As she crossed the threshold, the world around her shifted once again. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew thick with mist. The rivers roared louder, their waters crashing against the rocky banks. Nia's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the edge of the river. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the air, and she could hear voices, faint, ghostly voices, calling her name. Nia. Nia. She froze, her eyes darting around. The voices seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the mist. But as she listened more closely, she realized the voices were not calling to help her, they were trying to lure her into the river. Her body trembled with fear, but she forced herself to stay still. This was the first trial, the test of courage. The rivers were testing her resolve, trying to see if she would fall into their trap. But Nia wasn't going to give in. I won't be afraid, she whispered to herself, clenching her fists. I will find my father. As if in response, the wind died down, and the voices faded. The ground stopped trembling, and the mist began to clear. Nia took a deep breath, relief washing over her. She had passed the first trial. But she knew the next one would be even harder. The mist cleared completely, revealing a narrow bridge stretching across the churning waters of the twin rivers. Nia hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the bridge. As she walked, the air around her grew colder, and the whispers returned, this time louder and more insistent. "Nia," they called. "You must see the truth." Suddenly, the scene around her shifted. She was no longer on the bridge but standing in the village of Lira. It was a memory, one she had buried deep inside her. She saw herself as a little girl, sitting on her father's lap while he told her stories of the rivers. "Remember, Nia," her father had said, his voice warm and kind. "The rivers hold great power. But they also hold great danger. Never go near them." In the memory, young Nia had nodded, believing her father's every word. But now, as she stood in the present, watching the memory unfold, she noticed something strange. Her father's face was filled with worry, and his hands trembled as he spoke. He wasn't just warning her about the rivers, he was hiding something. Nia's chest tightened as the truth slowly dawned on her. Her father hadn't just been afraid of the rivers. He had been running from them. But why? What had he done? The memory faded, and Nia found herself back on the bridge, her heart heavy with the realization. She had uncovered part of the truth, but there was still more to learn. Nia's steps grew slower as she neared the end of the bridge. The air was thick with tension, and she knew that the final trial was just ahead. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped off the bridge and onto the rocky shore. Before her stood a tall figure cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its voice was deep and haunting. "To save your father, you must give something in return," it said. Nia swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. "What must I give?" The figure's eyes burned brighter as it spoke. "The rivers demand a sacrifice. To save your father, you must give up something precious. Something you hold dear." Nia's mind raced. What could she possibly give? What was precious enough to satisfy the rivers? She thought of her family, her home, her memories. She thought of her father, lost and waiting for her to bring him back. Then, with a heavy heart, she realized what she had to do. Nia stood before the shadowy figure, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of its demand pressing down on her. What could she possibly give? Everything she held dear flashed before her eyes, her mother, her village, her memories of growing up with her father. Each one tugged at her heart, but none seemed enough. Then it hit her. Her courage. The one thing that had carried her this far, the one thing that had always given her strength. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at the shadowy figure. "I'll give my courage," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, considering her offer. "Your courage is what has brought you to this point. If you give it up, you may never be brave enough to face what lies ahead." Nia knew this, but she had no other choice. She couldn't lose her father. Not now. She took a deep breath and nodded, her resolve firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Very well," the figure said. It raised its hand, and a strange light swirled around Nia, pulling at her chest. She gasped as the sensation grew stronger, as if something deep inside her was being drawn out. Her legs trembled, her hands shook, and for the first time since starting her journey, she felt truly afraid. The light disappeared, and Nia fell to her knees, weak and trembling. The figure remained silent, watching her. "The sacrifice has been accepted," it said, its voice a low rumble. Nia struggled to her feet, her body feeling heavy and drained. She no longer had the strength she once felt, but the path to her father was still ahead. She couldn't stop now. The ground beneath Nia trembled as the shadowy figure vanished into the air. The twin rivers, which had been violently churning, suddenly grew calm. Their waters gleamed like silver, and a narrow passage appeared between them, leading to a distant shore shrouded in mist. Nia felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. The courage that had driven her so far was gone, leaving behind a hollow feeling. Her legs felt weak, and her hands trembled, but she knew she had to keep moving. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the soft sound of her footsteps drowned out by the eerie silence around her. The spirits of the rivers watched her as she walked, their hollow eyes following her every move. Some of them whispered her name, others reached out as if to stop her, but she pressed on. Each step felt heavier than the last, but her determination remained. As Nia reached the shore on the other side of the rivers, she noticed something glimmering in the distance. A figure stood near the edge of the water, its silhouette dark and motionless. Her heart leaped in her chest as she realized who it was. "Papa," she called, her voice weak but filled with hope. The figure turned slowly, and Nia's breath caught in her throat. It was her father, but something was different. His face was pale, and his eyes were distant, as if he didn't fully recognize her. "Nia," he said, his voice soft and unsure. "Is it really you?" Tears welled up in Nia's eyes as she rushed forward. "Yes, Papa, it's me. I've come to take you home." But as she reached him, her father stepped back, his expression troubled. "I can't go with you," he whispered, shaking his head. "The rivers, they won't let me." Nia's heart sank at her father's words. "What do you mean, Papa?" "I crossed the rivers, I faced the trials, Her father raised his hand, silencing her. "The rivers took me because of a promise I made long ago," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I tried to escape the consequences, but the rivers don't forget. And now, they have bound me here." Nia's eyes widened in disbelief. "But there has to be a way. I'll do anything to bring you back home." Her father looked away, pain etched into his face. "The rivers have claimed me, Nia. My time is over. But you shouldn't have come. The price is too high. You've already given too much." Nia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I won't leave you here. I can't. There has to be a way." Her father's gaze softened, and he reached out to touch her face, his hand cold against her skin. "You've always been so brave, Nia. But bravery alone won't save us from the river's curse." As Nia stood there, feeling the weight of the moment crushing her, a sudden realization hit her. Her father had been bound by his own actions, but there might still be a way to break the curse. "The promise you made," Nia whispered, her mind racing. "What was it? What did you promise the rivers?" Her father's eyes darkened with sorrow. "I promised them a life, Nia. I promised them a soul in exchange for something I thought I needed. But I was wrong. The rivers claimed me for my broken word." Nia's heart pounded as she pieced it together. Her father had been bound by a deal he couldn't keep, and now the rivers held him captive. But if she could find a way to fulfill that promise, perhaps she could set him free. Nia's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to fulfill her father's promise. A soul was the price, but whose soul? Could she give her own life to save her father? The thought terrified her, but she would do anything to bring him back. Her father, seeing the conflict in her eyes, shook his head. "No, Nia. You can't give yourself. You've already sacrificed too much. But if I don't, you'll be stuck here forever," she cried, her voice breaking. Her father took her hands in his eyes filled with sadness. "I made my choices, and now I must live with them. You have a life ahead of you, Nia. Don't throw it away for my mistakes." Nia's chest tightened. She didn't want to leave him behind, but deep down, she knew he was right. She had a life to live, a future to fight for. But the thought of leaving him here, alone in the land of the rivers, was unbearable. As she stood there, torn between her love for her father and the weight of the river's curse, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The waters of the twin rivers churned violently, and the spirits that had been watching her suddenly surged forward, their hollow eyes filled with hunger.